Hello and welcome to Realm's Edge Gaming. In this episode we're going to take a look at the second story in the Chronicles of the Wanderers series, and the story is titled Old Whitebeard's Special, and it focuses on the Dwarden brewery of the Bearded Dragon, a place that's famed for its ales and where people of all races flock to its fires. Yet times are changing and now a terrible darkness is stirring. Perhaps now is the time to heed the words of old Whitebeard. There's a really nice introductory paragraph which begins by setting the scene. The bearded dragon had been in the keeping of the Edrundour Dwarden for 300 years. The eldest Longbeard who drank here would remark with approval that naught about it ever changed but that year's signature brew, and the sawdust on the floor. Those with longer memories still would recall too that it was Brognor Edrundour who, having led the return of his folk from Azir, had built an exact replica of the one kept by his distant forebears on the same site. Those grey hills, irrevocably tainted by the occupation of chaos, were a hard place to make any kind of living, but they were Dwarden lands, and it is often rightly said of the dispossessed that they would sooner be poor in the homes of their ancestors than be rich elsewhere. But the Edrundour were not poor. Indeed, with the occasional guidance of one white-bearded patron of extraordinarily lengthy memory, they prospered. The first character we meet is Breeder Edrundour, who is not even 10 years yet. She's just had a nightmare where she saw the moon transformed into a leering skull, which grew bigger and bigger in the sky. So she makes her way downstairs into the drinking area, and it is packed. It's standing room only, full of Dwarden from all over the Copperback Hills, human travellers from further afield, and even wanderers. There are 2 roaring hearths lit, and people are having a really good time. Breeder carries with her the small iron oak hammer that her mother made for her as a present for Grungni's Day, and outside it's pouring with rain. The Bearded Dragon brewery once sat on a trade route between Barak Zilfin and Barak Urbaz, but over time the nature of the trade routes, and therefore its clientele to the Bearded Dragon, altered. Nevertheless, travellers still allocated extra days' travel to visit the brewery. Drury the Wagoner, Gudrun and Dane, 3 Dwarden clientele, are grumbling about how there are now elves in the brewery and how that wouldn't have happened in Brognor's day. Brognor is Breeder's grandfather. Breeder ignores them and makes her way to her father, Bjarn. He's not a warrior, but he's still massively strong from carrying all of the barrels of ale. Above the bar is mounted a great axe called Reliable, and most of the clientele are actually looking at this strange character sat alone on a stool further down the bar. It says, the old Dwarden's hair was as white as the snow on a mountain top, and he wore it long, so long in fact that it flowed into his white beard, which itself lapped over his knees and fell well past the soles of his boots on the stretcher of his stool. His cloak was travel-worn, his trousers were muddy, silver mail and the occasional jewel twinkled below the outer layers. Breeder, with the insight of one as yet clear of the grudges and oaths of later life, had the strongest impression that if she could look even deeper, she would find something worth more than silver and gems. She wondered if he might be a descendant of the kings of the Khazalid Empire. The fortunes of the Dwarden were such that it was not uncommon to see kings and thanes drinking in the Bearded Dragon alongside goat herds and even elves. He was nursing a tankard of the Bearded Special. The annual tradition of the Special was one that the Edrundour line had always observed. Even in their long exile in the star halls of the Azerheim, they had continued their craft towards making commemorative ales, although the specials of those years were known for being sorrowful and bitter. Whitebeard raised the tankard to his lips, and to Breeder's astonishment, she saw that he was drinking from the metal tankard that Bjarn normally kept in pride of place on the mantel by Reliable, the axe. The quart tankard was pewter, with a hinged lid and a golden rune in old Khazalid that no one in the Edrundour line could still read, which still looked to Breda like two mountain peaks stacked on their sides. Whitebeard dampened his moustache as he took a considered sip. He smacked his lips thoughtfully. The circle of Dwarden and men around him grew hushed. Bjarn stood at the far end of the bar, with his elbow in the air, as though frozen mid-polish. Whitebeard nodded to himself and muttered as he lowered the tankard to the counter, and the watching Longbeards leaned in. Oblivious, Whitebeard lifted the tankard and took another sip. Half the taproom sighed, and Breda giggled despite herself. Whitebeard turned on his stool, hearing what even the elves had failed to, and gave her a crooked smile. His eyes sparkled like jewels in ancient treasures, and Breda felt her earlier unease lift from her at once. "You're up early, lass," he said, gesturing one-handed towards her woolen nightdress and bare feet. "Or up late." He winked and beckoned her towards him. "Come, girl, and help me, for I'm as yet undecided on this year's bearded special." Breda glanced at her father, and she was expecting a stern look and the promise of strong words to follow after closing. But he looked stunned that this stranger had spoken to her and waved her towards the empty stool beside him. Whitebeard bent down, displaying surprisingly flexibility for one so long of beard, and hoiked her onto the seat beside him. Breda became very aware of the hubbub dying around her. She swallowed and turned to Whitebeard as the old traveller leant in towards her. His beard smelled of all her father's beer and the Copperback Road. His face, for all its twinkling good humour, looked worn. "Are they still watching, lass?" Breda looked over her shoulder. "Yes." Whitebeard chuckled and then pushed his tankard across the counter towards her. "Go on, take a sip. Tell me what you think." Breda did as she was asked. Despite not yet being 10, she was a brewer's daughter and a Dwarden to boot, and knew her way around an ale. Whitebeard nodded approvingly as she took a taste, leaning back from the counter to fish in his travel bags for tobacco and pipe. "Go on then, lass. Speak up." It's nice." Whitebeard laughed until his mail rustled against his chest. "I suppose you have to say that, what with your father hovering over my shoulder like the ghost of Grimnir." He tamped a pinch of dried leaves into the bowl of his pipe and lit it, shaking off his fingers. He took a sup of the stem, still chuckling to himself. "Aye, I know who you are, and I know whose blood runs in your veins. So, tell me what you really think." Breda took another sip, and she concentrated hard. It could be sweeter. Spoken like every birdling who has ever asked about anything. Have another go." Breda supped again. "This has been a good year. The beer's too bitter for it. It should be brighter." "And when the bearded dragon prospers, so too does the copperback, eh?" That's what my father says. "And you always heed your father?" Breda looked shocked. "Of course." "Good." Whitebeard chewed thoughtfully on his pipe. "A Dwarden should always heed their elders, master their ways, and learn from their mistakes." He puffed a moment longer. "If it were me, the Dregsons, who work over the valley, yonder hill, have cultivated a fine crop of clinkenberries this year. Storing this beer in old clinkenberry barrels will stand it in fine stead, and spread your good year a little wider to those as have need of a little fortune." So, Bjarn, who's Breda's father, straight away, after hearing that advice, beckons Drury the wagoner over to arrange for the purchase of all the Clinkenberry barrels, it's a tongue twister, that the Dregsons would be able to sell. And then the mysterious figure, after kind of giving the advice, just stands up, and turns to leave. The Dwarden laughed. "Quite right, lass," he puffed amiably. "Quite right." Sinking the rest of the tankard in one gulp, he replaced the pipe in his mouth and drew up his hood. Then he stood up, bending up to pick up the large rune axe that stood propped against the bar. "You're leaving already?" said Breeder. "Aye, I must." "Why?" Whitebeard gave her a tired grin. "Been a while since anybody's asked me that." "You look tired." Whitebeard sighed as he adjusted his cloak over his armour. Then he winked at her, and the sadness she thought that she'd seen disappeared into the lines of his smile. "Maybe I'll pass this way again sometime. Mine is thirsty work." So time passes, and Breeder sees the old Whitebeard many times over the years, and she was always surprised that he appears at the same time each year when Bjorn, her father, was bringing out the first samples of Bearded Special for sampling and tasting. It's really strange because in the Spiral Crux, which is where they're located in Shamon, the realm of metal, even time is changeable, but without fail it's the same time every year. When Breeder was 19, she asked what the tankard was that old Whitebeard would drink from, saying, "It looks rather plain, apart from, the old rune on the side of it." And Bjorn said, "It's a Clinkerhun letter from the old empire." Brognar knew that much, but even he wasn't old enough to remember the ancestors' language. So Brognar was his father's father. It was the grandfather, wasn't it? So it's been passed kind of down through through the family, but it's always stayed there. So it's something that Brognar was given, but that even they kind of don't know the old language either. And Breeder says, "How did he get it?" Bjorn nodded towards Whitebeard where he sat, sampling that year's special, as he had every year since Breeder had been 9, and long before then. The first year after Brognar reopened the Bearded Dragon, he came in through that door, sat in that very stool, gave it to your grandfather, and asked for a taste of the special. He gave Brognar some suggestions, which my father was not too proud to heed. And when he was finished, the old Whitebeard asked him to do him a favour and to keep the tankard for his next visit. He said that it'd bring the brewery luck, and it did, and after 100 years or so, Brognar started displaying it up there on the mantle next to Reliable. What was Whitebeard like back then? Bjorn coughed into his hand and thought for a moment. "I can only tell you what he was like when I was young." "Which was?" He nodded again toward the old Dwarden. "Like that." "You mean he's not aged in 300 years? Bjorn shrugged. "Maybe it's because he drinks Bearded Special." So, after that, they kind of find out, that's where they kind of get the tankard from. Years pass by and still Whitebeard continues to visit, though it's less frequently. Dwarden from the Copperback Hills would wait religiously for his visits, where he would sample the new special and say things like, "Might have been a tad stronger," or "a bit hoppy this year, wouldn't you agree?" And for a long time the Bearded Dragon prospered, but slowly were visited by humans and elves less and less, as the trade road where they're located becomes too dangerous and expensive for people to travel on, because so many mercenaries needed to be hired to kind of protect the things that were being taken through the road. There was lots of talk about dead spirits, restless dead, things rising up, and it actually says that it was cheaper for people to commission a Caradron Overlord skyship. Now one night, Drury the wagoner comes into the pub, and he's just been attacked by a group of chain rasps on the road, and it kind of reinforces that the road's kind of becoming even more dangerous. It says that he comes forward and he kind of puts his axe onto the table, as one might present the landlord with a rat. It says, Breeder filled a mug of Bearded Special from one of the early tapped kegs and poured it over the Drury's injured hand. Crystals of what looked like amethyst buried in the cuts hissed as the beer ran over them. Chain rasps, Drury muttered, and not 5 miles from this door. Breeder didn't answer. Silently she marvelled at Whitebeard's foresight. The previous year he'd suggested sprinkling in a few capillarian flame seeds, commenting that next year to come was looking nippy. Flame seeds were a well-known spice, even in Ayada. They were much lesser known as a medicament against supernatural chills. What's the realm coming to? Drury complained. So the road's becoming even more dangerous, and later that year, the bearded dragon even starts to kind of protect the brewery. They add in some extra strong shutters for the windows, and they brace the door with brass rod. The brewery is the only business actually doing okay. And there's another Duardin that kind of turns up and kind of asks, Duardin are very proud, aren't they? But kind of mentions that it would be good for some kind of financial aid, or for someone to kind of put a bit of money towards protecting the road so that, other businesses around might prosper. And Breeder kind of hears this and, suggests to her father, Bjarn, that maybe they do help the other kind of Duardin and pay for other kind of mercenaries to kind of protect and guard the road. But it's quite interesting what Bjarn says. He says, look first to your own. Bjarn took a hand in both of his, as though he were imparting her something of import. Build your walls high and sink your foundations deep. That's the way the Duardin have always done things. That is the way that we will endure. So, very, very stubborn, doesn't really want to help others. The next time travellers arrive at the Bearded Dragon on their way to Barrack Zilfin, Bjarn actually gives them some gold to buy him a blunderbuss from the Caradron overlord Skyfort. Bjarn by this point is too old and frail to wield the reliable axe, and actually gifts it to Breeder. He's not that well either. And later on it says, that year Whitebeard visited early. The tap room was full, as it had been in many years. Every Duardin still in the Copperback Hills was there, but though both fires had been lit for the first time in decades, the mood was grim. How did you know to come? She asked. Her eyes were raw from the conscious effort of not weeping. Her hair was braided in the way her father had done it when she was a girl, and as her mother had worn hers. Whitebeard sat across from her, drinking alone, as he almost always did, except for the odd occasion when a human or elf who did not know him would join him at the bar, invariably departing with a tall tale and words of wisdom that they would soon not forget. That had not happened in years. Too early in the year for the special. Instead, a quart of the perennial favourite, Dragon's Hoard, filled his usual tankard. Despite sipping at it for well over an hour, it seemed no closer to emptying. I always know where I'm needed, he said, his voice assuming a sympathetic gruffness. He looked down into his tankard. I warned your grandfather not to build here. All of them that returned with him from Azir. There's chaos in the rocks here still, and in the water, but they wouldn't hear me. This is where our ancestors built, said Breeder. It's where we'll build. Whitebeard snorted without humour. He looked tired as always, but now there were bags under his eyes, so deep they seemed to draw down the long beard's face. That's what they said. With one hand, the other still wrapped around his tankard, Whitebeard fished a small bottle from his cloak pocket and set it on the bar. What's this? Breeder picked it up. The glass was too dark for her to make out what was inside. Beyond that, it was a liquid. A good beer's all about the water. Brogden knew that, and so did his ancestors when they first brewed beer here. He shrugged. I thought that if they made good enough beer, nobody would drink the water. And there's a kind of power in good beer. Duardin will fight over it. Aye, but they'll be best friends afterwards. We won't make much beer with this water. I should hope not. Whitebeard chuckled. This is water from Lake Lethis, from the underworld of Stygics. in the realm of death. Drink even this much, and you'll wake up sometime next century, wondering where you are and what your name is. But add a few drops to the barrel." He shrugged, sipped his cup of hoard, as though the suggestion was hers to take or leave. "It'll bring whoever drinks from it a sense of peace." He looked upwards, and when they do, through the waters of Lethis, they might feel the dead of their ancestors' hall, stirring to join the round by their side. Breda's hand closed around the little bottle. Dwarden were not known for carelessness, but she was absurdly terrified that she might drop it. I've never heard of this Lethis. From Shaiish. It must have taken you months to get it here, if not years. It must have cost you a fortune." He sighed. "It always comes down to cost with the Edrundour, doesn't it?" Breda's grip on the bottle tightened in anger. "How long have you known my father was going to die?" Whitebeard regarded her from beneath bushy white brows, and despite her 100 years, Breda suddenly felt very young and foolish for having raised her voice in anger. What he said, however, when he decided to, unnerved her even more. "You think he was the only one?" So, the Whitebeard visited the dispossessed brewery even less and less after her father's burial, but when he did, he always looked much older and even more haggard. As all the Dwarden are talking in the brewery, they hear a strange noise, and someone suggests it's rats, and it really offends Breda. They keep hearing the noise, so Breda goes down into the cellar to check the pipes. Down in the cellar, the ancestors' tombs are also there, and she's actually attacked by the reanimated corpse of her grandfather, Brognor Edrundour. She's struggling to defend herself, but someone actually saves her by using an axe on Brognor. Whitebeard stood over her. He looked bone-tired, leaning on his axe with both arms crossed over its bloodied head, his long beard tumbling over the ornate blade, past the haft and to the floor. Even so, he found it in him to smile like a beardling who had just helped his grandmother to find a lost coin. "I heard you shouting." Breda's mouth worked, but no sound seemed to come out of it. Her head rolled until it was staring at the corpse on the ground. "Brognor Edrundour." Whitebeard sighed. He deserved better. "How did this happen?" Breda said. "The runes on the tombs are supposed to keep the bodies from being tampered with or their spirits disturbed. They were written by rune lords in Asierheim over 3 centuries ago." Straightening with some clear discomfort, Whitebeard took the cheek of his axe like a crutch and ran his spare hand across Bjarn's tomb. It might have been the sudden rush of air to her brain, making her vision blurry, but the runes appeared to glow faintly, as though newly struck, as his hand passed over them. "You might want to renew these, if you've inherited any of Brognor's rune skill. If not," he frowned and gestured back over his shoulder. "If not, then I'd double the locks and put something stout and heavy on top of that trapdoor." "But," she trailed off, turning again to look at her grandfather, strewn and ruined on the floor of the crypt. "I know, lass, but when you grow a beard as long as mine, you get a keen sense of what can and can't wait until morning." "You look exhausted. You're not exactly skipping yourself." "No, I suppose not, but then some of us are older than we used to be." "We're all a bit older, lass. That's just the way of things." "You've not aged an hour since I was a girl." "Then you're not looking close enough," he snapped. The Longbeard's brow prickled until his flush of temper seemed to subside. "Forgive me, girl. It's been a hard road getting here, and a long night. It's been a year of long nights, and then some. I've got a lot of work to do in the realms, and those I do it for have a habit of making it harder for me. And themselves. Then won't you stay this one night?" Whitebeard lowered his head and sighed. "How many times have you asked me that over the last 100-odd years? How many ways can a Dwarden come up of saying no? If I'm here, then I'm not out there." "Don't you need to rest? Even Grunkney needs to down tools every once in a while. Or so I'm told." His moustaches twitched in what had been less weary might have become a smile. But then, he's a god, and he has that luxury. What about a home? Once, for a moment, he looked wistful. In that, at least, I'm not so estranged from my people. Few of us have one in these times, and that's why I can't stay. But I wouldn't say no to a swift half of the bearded special for the road. He turned to lead her back upstairs. When Breda reached out to touch his arm, a tingle ran down her fingers, as if from touching a great weight of gold. But not unlike the first time she met the old Dwarden, she had the sense of something deeper and greater than the stone under the hills. Rest, she said. Just for one night. If not for yourself, then for me. He turned back. For you, you say? The dead assail my door, if you'd listen to Drury. My own ancestor stirs beneath my house. She shivered and hugged herself. I doubt I will have any rest myself tonight, but having you and your axe under my roof will do my chances no harm. Whitebeard opened his mouth, but she saw his protestations crumbled under the weight of a sigh. His brow unfurrowed, his stern jaw unclenched. Whatever had busied him for the last half-decade, it had left him too weary to argue about any more. Well, if it's for you, it would be nice to feel the comfort of a bed, I suppose, and to looking forward to a proper breakfast in the morning. You will have both, Breda promised, and first thing in the morning, I will have Drury prepare his wagon to take you wherever you need to go. That does all sound appealing, lass. Though, someone will have to pay for it in the morning, I don't doubt. Oh no, after all you've done for my father and my grandfather, I'll not take a penny from you now. Whitebeard's face again tested that almost smile. I wasn't thinking about myself. So, unfortunately, over time, the farms all go. The Dwarden go. And Breda is left alone. She doesn't go out anymore. And eventually the runes on the door fail and she's attacked by Nighthaunt. She uses the Caradron Overlord blunderbuss to defend herself, but eventually takes up Reliable the axe. And it's a bit strange when she picks up the axe. This is the one that's been on the above the pub, above the bar. It says it was the one that kind of no one's even wielded in the past. Not even Brognor had spoken about wielding it on the return from Azir. Where it came from and who it had originally belonged to is a mystery, and yet it seemed to welcome Breda's grip as much as she did its weight in her hand. Wraithlight shimmered across its blade, and the centuries had blunted its edge somewhat, but these were foes without form to cut, and she did not expect its physical sharpness to be any consequence here. So she picks up the axe, and she also takes up the tankard of Whitebeard to honour the oath that her grandfather took to look after it, and she actually leaves the bearded dragon, the pup, which is kind of being enveloped by these Nighthaunt. It almost looks like it's on fire, almost looks like it's ablaze. And she kind of makes her way out through the window and outside. And, obviously she's devastated at leaving the pub. You came, said a voice from the road behind her. Good, there's clearly hope for you yet. Whirling back from the burning inn, she lowered Reliable in astonishment at the sight of Whitebeard. Nighthawk gloam haloed his unruly mane of white hair. His cloak was flung back over his shoulder, gromril scales and bright gems shining by witchfire and fell moonlight. His axe rested idle on his shoulder, but from the slump in his posture and the drawn look to his face, he'd been fighting hard. The dead seemed to avoid him, flowing around him or fleeing outright to the hills, rather than approach too near. What do you mean? He gestured towards the brewery. You could have died for it, but what would you have achieved? The dispossessed cleave to their old ways, but don't forget, your ancestors are those who had the good sense to up and run when all was lost. This land of yours, he stamped his boot on the ground. This is stone, you'll find it anywhere. By this point as well, tattered scraps of cloud raced across the huge skull face of a moon. So, It's just like the start when Breda was having the nightmare as a little girl and the moon was a skull face. It's actually become that. Squinting into the haze of ghosts at Whitebeard's back, she caught a few of prouder aspect and dwarf in shape. They appeared to be with him, dwarfing with tall draconic helms, dwarfing with cropped beards and strange suits of armour. Others that looked like... Her knees felt weak and she sank to the ground. Mother? Father? My ancestors? I warned Brognor not to build here, said Whitebeard. Chaos in the rocks and in the water. I told him, but he wouldn't listen. Too proud. Your father was the same. For the obvious want of a special on which to pass comment this year, let me pass on this wisdom instead. He tilted his head back, looking up as the brewery roof slowly collapsed. This is what will always happen when the Dwarden seal themselves away behind their gates and wait out the darkness. You asked me to stay and watch over your hall. In a moment of weakness for the hearth I once knew, I agreed. But what is the brewer without the farmers and millers and carters, without the merchants and buyers in distant lands? What are any of us without our fellow Dwarden, without the humans and the elves who join us in shunning the darkness if we let them? The shadow will pass, aye, but it must be made to do so. Breda listened to every word, but she was no longer looking at him. The ghost of Brunhilde Edrendower smiled at her from Whitebeard's halo. She was wearing the wooden hammer that she had made for Breda's 6th birthday gift. She looked proud. She looked entirely untroubled from the defilement of her tomb. Despite the destruction of her world, Breda felt freer of that than she had in a long time, since she'd been a girl. Breda lifted the tankard she'd held on to without thinking. This is yours, she said. Keep it. Build again somewhere else. Anywhere else. If the beer is good enough, then the Dwarden will come. And perhaps others too. Turn no one away. She looked at the tankard, studying the ancient, clinker-hung character on its metal face. Why me? An ancestor of yours held something for me once, long ago. As I told your grandfather, you do me a favour by keeping it for me. I will do as you ask. She looked up to thank him, but Whitebeard had already turned from her and was walking away into the mist. He seemed to sink into the stone of the hills as the ranks of the ancestral dead closed around him, and then themselves faded into the wind. Shivering from its touch, she turned, taking one last look at her ancestral home as it disintegrated in cold fire. Then she took up Whitebeard's tankard, shouldered reliable, and walked away. So, that's the end of the story. I would love to get your opinion on what you thought about it in regards to the Dispossessed. Are you expecting that we'll see a return of the faction? The story was set in Shamon. We know that there's something happening under the mountains. It was really interesting when Whitebeard said about Grungni, not needing rest, but then he's a god. It sounds like he might know a little bit more to do with that. Thank you ever so much for listening. If you have not subscribed to the channel already, if you could do so, that would be great. And if you could drop a like too, it would be much appreciated. Really looking forward to speaking with you in the comments below. Thanks and goodbye.